Grace to you and peace from God our Creator and from the Lord Jesus Christ. As the poet says, learning to love differently is hard. Our human minds are just wired so that we always assume that bigger is better. We go for complicated over simple. And Lord knows we love titles. I'd like you to remember that I am the Right Reverend Dr. Porter Taylor, because titles somehow give us an authority that we don't have from simply just being Porter. So it's interesting that when Jesus sends the disciples out, he says, you don't get to take your briefcase, you don't need to take your new shoes from Tops, you don't get to take your credit cards, you don't get to take your Twitter account, you just go. And you just go to the first place you see and you say, peace. Now, to get a sense of why that's hard, because it's always been hard, let's flip to the Old Testament. We hear today the story of Naaman, and it's a story about healing, but it's not what you think. So, yes, it is. Naaman does have leprosy, and yes, he does get cured. That's all true. But leprosy is not really his major disease. Naaman suffers from what we might call the hierarchical complex. Now, that sounds obscure, but it's something that's close to us, that it's a sea in which we swim. It means that bigger is always better. Complexity is always what we seek, and so is hierarchy. We know how important you are by the size of your house or the location of your neighborhood. So if you hear that someone lives on Fifth Avenue, New York, or on Hogwaller Way in Mars Hill, North Carolina, what assumptions do you make about their relative importance? How do we look at how many people work for them, or how busy they are, or what car they drive, or on and on and on? And I wonder if the hierarchical complex keeps us from getting the radical good news of the incarnation. The Word becomes flesh and lives among us, among everyone, among every place, among all conditions. It's important that Jesus wasn't born in Jerusalem. He was born in nowhere. He was born in Nazareth. His parents weren't royalty. His father was a carpenter. And he didn't hang out with the members of the Fortune 500. He went among the poor. He sought out the sick. He looked for anyone who was in need. And so when we read about Naaman in the Old Testament reading, yes, it is about leprosy, but it's really about his blindness because he suffers from the hierarchical complex. So let's go back to the story. Naaman is high up in the power structure of Aram. But the source of his cure doesn't come from any rulers, doesn't come from any wise men, doesn't come from any important people with titles. His cure comes from a slave girl who's a foreigner, who's an alien, who has no name in the story. Yes, Naaman follows her lead, but notice how he does that. He has the king of Aram write to the king of Israel. It'd be like telling someone in Florida about a chiropractor in Black Mountain, and they have the governor of Florida write to Roy Cooper. Particularly when this happens, the king of Israel loses his temper and tears his clothes when he gets the letter, because he thinks this is about power. This is about what Jesus calls the world. which is always about power, prestige, and possessions. The world says that only important people can talk about important things. And what happens is that the common folks get in their head that anything important has to be on that level, and somehow their lives are less important because of what they own, where they live, what they do. Remember what they said about Jesus and his miracles? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Black Mountain? This is why we need prophets. Elijah sends for Naaman, and when Naaman comes, Elijah says, I'm not going to even see this person in person. I'm not going to see him face to face. Instead, he sends out a messenger and says, just go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and you'll be cured. Because Elijah is giving Naaman a test. What is it that you really want? Do you want to feel how important you are by seeing an important prophet, or do you want to be healed? Which is it? And of course, Naaman flunks his test. He goes into a rage because he's been disrespected. Now let's pause for a moment, because it's so much easier to talk about these Old Testament people than to talk about us. What is it we want? What is it we want for our country? What is it we want for our community? What is it we want for our own souls? What's important to us? And do we believe that God is capable of fulfilling our wanting regardless of how it happens? Or are we like Naaman? Do we only stand at the State House screaming at our leaders that will never treat us, the leaders will never treat us in the way we ought to be treated? Do we buy our prized possessions thinking that transformation is a commercial exchange? If I just get the right stuff, I'll be a better person. And where do we think miracles come from? Or do we even think miracles actually come? Because the only question that matters is, do we think that God has power to change us and change the world? Not because of us, but because of God. Naaman forgets his real seeking. He forgets he wants to be healed. He wants to be clean. He wants to be like his fellow citizens, not marked as a person who is diseased and different. So don't get me wrong, I'm all for political involvement. And I believe the political choices we make before us next year are exceedingly important and are indeed theological. But we need to be clear about what is what. Wholeness comes from inner transformation, and the source for that transformation is God. And what has to be crucified in order for that to happen is our own sense of self-importance, our own sense of entitlement. On the spiritual path, we're not earning anything. We're not proving anything. We're not buying anything. We're holding out our hands to receive the gifts of God for the people of God. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. So where do our answers come from? Not from rulers, but from slave girls. Not from kings, but from prophets. Not from complicated procedures, but from wading in the water. This is how I found that out. May it be helpful to you. In 1982, I was working on my PhD at Emory University, and I was looking forward to the first set of letters in front of my name. I wouldn't be Mr. Taylor, I'd now be Dr. Taylor. I'd be someone important. So I was immersed in theology and poetry and philosophy, and I was so alive from my neck up, and I was so dead from my head down. One day, a fellow student told me about a homeless shelter that was opening up at an Episcopal church very close to Emory University, where I was going to school. Now, in the 80s, the early 80s, I was way too sophisticated to go to church, but I was studying. My doctorate was in Christian mysticism, but that was an academic enterprise. So I volunteered to go to the church to be at the homeless shelter at 5 o'clock on a Thursday. I got there, we gave everyone dinner, we got everyone settled, finally everyone went to bed, and me and my coworker, whose name was Martha, stayed up every night, all night. When everyone got up in the morning and got fed and got ready to get on the bus, I thought we were done, but Martha said to me, "Do you want to go to the Friday morning Eucharist?" I didn't exactly say yes, but I sort of got herded in with everyone else. St. Bartholomew's used to be the ugliest church in the Episcopal Church. It's now beautified, but back then it had an altar. It was one of the few places that had an altar in the round. It had an altar in the middle of the church, and there was a light that shone down on the altar, and then there was this circle of light around it. So we sort of gathered around just inside the circle of light, and I sort of backed into the darkness. I hadn't been to church in a long time. I found it impossible to say the creed. If I could have screamed in the sermon, I would have, but I was too polite to do that. But when the priest came around with the bread, I started to weep. And when the chalice bearer came around with the chalice of wine, I wept harder. I discovered I could not get to God in my mind. I had too many fences up. But my body and my heart got underneath those barriers. And I found a hunger for God that I didn't know was there. Like Naaman, on the outside, my life looked good. I was getting degrees, I had resumes, I was going to get a title, but like Naaman, I had an infirmity, not leprosy, but a frozen heart. And I did not know how to be healed. What I discovered was it didn't take a doctor, it didn't take a degree in philosophy, it didn't even take a professor. It was simply a matter of opening my hands to receive the goodness of the Lord. It was simply a matter of drinking from the cup of salvation to discover that I could be healed. It was like walking into the River Jordan. So my brothers and sisters, the truth is all of us have some form or another of leprosy, but we do not need a specialist. We don't need to order anything from Amazon. And Lord knows we don't need to bolster our own sense of importance. We simply need to open ourselves up to God and listen to the voice that tells us to get into the water and to be clean. Amen.